My mother stole my $80,000 to buy my sister a house. I fled to another country. 10 years later, my father called, choking back tears. Your mother is gone. She left you a letter. I thought that letter would say, I'm sorry. But when I crossed an ocean and walked back into that fractured house, the first thing my sister did was block the doorway. With the same entitled pout our mother had always indulged, she said coldly, Ellie, Mom's house is mine. It's what she wanted. You're making good money overseas. Surely you're not going to fight me for this. Then my father handed me a yellowed envelope. The handwriting inside was shaky, the ink smeared. The last line read, Ellie, I know now how wrong I was. I can never repay what I owe you in this lifetime. If there is a next life, I want to be your mother again, and this time, I will give you all the fairness you deserved. I held that letter, staring at my mother's smiling black and white portrait on the wall, and wept. Some apologies take a lifetime to arrive. Some only come after the person is gone. The afternoon my mother stole my future, she was stirring a pot of pork bone and corn soup. The kitchen smelled of ginger and simmering stock, steam fogging the narrow window of our old apartment until the gray winter light outside turned soft and diffuse. Mom, the card and the pin. Just hold it for 2 months, okay? Once Dan and I signed the purchase agreement, I'll need it back right away. I held out my debit card. My fingers were stiff. It felt like handing over a piece of my own rib cage, something vital, something that had grown with me. On the nightstand in the apartment I shared with Dan, I'd left a folder with the purchase offer already printed, the inspection report highlighted in yellow, the mortgage pre-approval letter tucked into a crisp manila sleeve. We'd spent 6 months getting to that folder. Martha Vance took the card the way she took most things from me over the years, casually, as if it had always belonged to her. Stop worrying. A mother would never cheat her own daughter. It's safer with me than in any bank. Those bankers don't care about you. She slipped the card into the pocket of her apron, next to a crumpled tissue, and turned back to the stove. The wooden spoon scraped the bottom of the pot in slow, contented circles. Your sister's coming for dinner. I made extra. Dan's working late again. We won't wait for him. Go wash up. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on that apron pocket, where $80,000, 9 years of my life, sat folded against her hip. 9 years of debugging code until my eyes burned, of drinking cold coffee instead of eating lunch, of watching younger colleagues leave at 5 while I stayed glued to my monitor because overtime meant a bonus and a bonus meant 1 month closer to a down payment. 9 years of Dan and me dreaming about a 2-bedroom condo with south-facing windows for his drafting table and a kitchen where we could finally cook together instead of reheating takeout in the cramped rental we'd shared since graduate school. I was 30 years old. I had a spreadsheet with every dollar accounted for. Closing costs. Moving fees. Property tax estimates. A tiny line item for a ring. Dan had saved 6 months for it. A simple gold band with a small diamond he'd been hiding in his sock drawer. I'd found it by accident while doing laundry and had to sit down on the bedroom floor, my hands pressed over my mouth, because I didn't want him to hear me crying through the thin walls. All of it, every late night, every skipped vacation, every thrift store coat I'd worn until the lining shredded, was in that card. Ellie, you're blocking the way. Sophie's voice cut through the steam like a needle. She nudged past me in suede ankle boots that probably cost as much as our security deposit, a shopping bag swinging from her wrist, its oversized logo glinting under the hallway light. A cloud of expensive perfume trailed behind her, something floral and musky that clashed with the homely smell of soup. New boots. I didn't mean it as an accusation, but Sophie's chin lifted defensively. They were on sale. Half off. She dropped the shopping bag onto the couch, where it landed next to a pile of her other recent purchases, a silk blouse still in its tissue paper, a box from a boutique bakery. God, Mom, that soup smells incredible. I've been thinking about it all week. Martha's whole face transformed. The deep lines around her eyes softened into something almost tender, and her shoulders, usually tight with chronic worry, dropped an inch. Of course you have, sweetheart. I got the best ribs. Not a bit of gristle. Go wash up, dinner's almost ready. You're the best, Mom. Sophie wrapped an arm around Martha's shoulders and squeezed. Then she glanced back at me, and her eyes did that thing they'd done since we were children, a quick inventory of my clothes, my hair, my posture, before she dismissed me with a flick of her eyebrows. So, Ellie, still house hunting. I heard prices are insane right now. Honestly, I don't know why you're so set on buying. When you get married, isn't the house supposed to be the husband's responsibility? Dan should be handling this, not you. There it was. The casual dismissal of everything I'd worked for, wrapped in a smile. Sophie had perfected this maneuver by the time she was 12, the ability to make my achievements sound embarrassing and her entitlements sound like wisdom. He's my partner, I said, keeping my voice even. We're building something together. Right. Together. Sophie's tone suggested this was a charming but naive concept, like believing in fairy tales. She turned back to Martha. Mom, did I tell you? Greg's parents invited us to their lake house for Thanksgiving. It's stunning. 8 bedrooms, right on the water. His mother said I have exquisite taste. Martha beamed. Of course she did. You've always had an eye for the finer things. I walked to the bathroom and ran the cold water over my wrists. In the mirror, my face looked drawn and gray. I'd been sleeping 5 hours a night for weeks, picking up freelance projects on top of my full-time job to pad the savings account that was supposed to be untouchable. The fluorescent bathroom light picked out the dark circles under my eyes, the chapped skin at the corners of my mouth. I looked older than 30. I looked like someone who'd been running for a long time without knowing where the finish line was. From the kitchen, Martha's voice drifted in, low and conspiratorial. Eleanor's always been too independent. I've told her, a woman who tries too hard scares men away. She doesn't know how to let someone take care of her. Look at Sophie. She understands how the world works. Mom, stop. Sophie giggled. Ellie's just different. Different. That was the word they'd wrapped around me like a label since I was old enough to form opinions of my own. Too serious. Too driven. Too unwilling to perform the softness they expected from a daughter. When I was 6 years old and we both tumbled into the duck pond at the park, my mother scooped Sophie up first, held her, soothed her, wrapped her in a dry towel from the picnic basket. I stood shivering on the muddy bank, water streaming from my hair, my dress clinging to my skinny legs, waiting for someone to notice I was cold. I waited so long my lips turned blue. I got pneumonia. My mother told everyone I'd always been sickly. She never mentioned she'd left me standing in wet clothes for 20 minutes while she comforted my screaming sister, who hadn't even swallowed any water. I still remembered the cold. The particular shock of it, not just the pond water, but the slow, creeping realization that I was invisible. That my mother's love had a pecking order, and I was not at the top. At the dinner table, my father Henry shuffled in from work, his warehouse jacket smelling of cardboard and machine oil and the faint metallic tang of the forklift batteries he maintained. He sat down heavily, picked up his fork, and didn't speak. He rarely did. 40 years of marriage had taught him that silence was the safest strategy. When Martha's mood swung, and they swung often, Henry made himself small and quiet and unobtrusive, a piece of furniture that breathed. Sophie filled the silence effortlessly. Office gossip about a coworker's disastrous presentation. A glowing review of a new brunch spot downtown with avocado toast and bottomless mimosas. A weekend trip to a coastal town 3 hours away, where she and Greg had stayed at a boutique hotel and taken Instagram photos on the pier at sunset. Martha listened with rapt attention, nodding at all the right moments, sliding the best pieces of pork onto Sophie's plate. "Eat more, sweetheart. You're too thin." "Mom, it's called being fit. Everyone's into wellness now. You wouldn't understand." The mountain of meat on Sophie's plate grew taller. I ate quietly, mechanically, thinking about Dan hunched over his drafting table at the architecture firm, erasing and redrawing client revisions for the 3rd time that day. His texts had grown shorter in the past week, not cold, just exhausted. He was carrying too much, same as me. But we kept going because the end was in sight, a place of our own, a door we could close, a life that was finally, irrevocably ours. "Eleanor." Martha's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade through butter. "That money you left with me. I've been thinking, it's a waste just sitting there. My friend Linda's son works at an investment firm. He mentioned a high-yield savings product. The returns are much better than a checking account. Let me put it in for you." I set my fork down carefully. "No. We needed liquid. We're making an offer next month. There are short-term options. You can withdraw whenever you need." She waved her hand dismissively, the way she might wave away a fly. "Even an extra few $100s in interest is better than nothing. Don't worry, would your own mother cheat you?" "Yeah, Ellie," Sophie chimed in, licking sauce off her fingers. "Let Mom handle it. You work so much you barely have time to think. And honestly, with Dan's situation..." She trailed off meaningfully. "Who knows if you'll even need that money for a house anytime soon." The casual cruelty of it landed like a slap. She was implying, with a smile on her face and pork grease on her chin, that my relationship might not survive. That my plans were flimsy, unserious, not worth protecting. That I was foolish to believe anyone would stay. I looked at Martha. Her expression was perfectly composed, a mask of maternal concern. But underneath it, I recognized something sharper. An old, familiar calculation. She had never approved of Dan, not because he was unkind or irresponsible, but because he was ordinary. A junior architect from a working-class family, no trust fund, no lake house, no connections. He couldn't elevate our family's status the way Greg, with his business degree and his parents' waterfront property, could. "No," I said. My voice was quieter than I intended, but steady. "That money is for our home. It's not going anywhere until we sign the contract. It stays in checking." A chill settled over the table, cold as a window left open in winter. Henry glanced up from his plate, looked from me to Martha, then back down. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble, but he said nothing. He never did. I'd spent years wondering if my father's silence was agreement or cowardice, and I'd concluded it didn't matter. The result was the same. Martha's smile thinned to a hard, compressed line. "Fine. Your money, your rules. A mother tries to help and gets treated like a criminal in her own home." "Mom, don't bother," Sophie said, rolling her eyes with theatrical disdain. Ellie's always been like this. Won't listen to anyone. Honestly, if she wants to throw her money away on a condo with a guy who can't even afford half the down payment, that's her mistake to make. Some people have to learn the hard way. I stood up and started clearing the dishes. My hands were shaking, but I kept them moving, stacking plates, scraping bones into the trash, running the water hot enough to sting. No one offered to help. They never did. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. The stain was shaped like a lopsided continent. It had been there since I was 12, when a pipe burst in the unit above us and nobody bothered to repaint. I remembered staring at that same stain the night before I left for college, the night my mother told me she'd co-signed a loan for Sophie's private high school tuition but couldn't help with my dorm deposit. "You're so capable, Eleanor," she'd said, patting my hand. "You'll figure something out." I'd taken out another student loan. Sophie had gotten a new laptop for graduation, wrapped in a big red bow. Capable. That was the word they used to dress up neglect. To make my survival feel like a gift they'd given me. I thought about Dan. His steady hands, his quiet patience, the way he never pushed when I came home from family dinners hollowed out and silent. He would just make tea, remembering without asking that I took it with honey, no milk, and sit beside me on our second-hand couch until the tension leaked out of my shoulders. We'd been together since our junior year of college, 9 years of slow, stubborn, unglamorous building. He'd proposed last spring, on a rainy Tuesday evening, in our tiny kitchen. No restaurant. No photographer hiding in the bushes. Just him, kneeling on the cracked linoleum in his socks, holding a ring he'd saved a year for. "Ellie," he'd said, his voice cracking slightly, "I know I can't give you the world. But I can give you everything I have." I'd said yes before he finished the sentence. Now I pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars, and tried to silence the voice in my head, my mother's voice, whispering that I didn't deserve to keep anything good. The next morning was Saturday. Dan and I met the real estate agent at a 2-bedroom condo near the metro line. It was a resale, but well-maintained, hardwood floors with a warm honey patina, decent light pouring through windows that faced southeast, a compact kitchen with butcher block counters that Dan immediately started mentally redesigning. "We could knock out this wall," he murmured, sketching in the air with his finger. "Open it up to the living room. And over here, a breakfast nook. You could drink your coffee in the sun." I leaned against the doorframe, watching him. The morning light caught the gray just beginning to thread through his temples, the faint creases beside his eyes. He was still the same person I'd fallen in love with in a crowded college library, bent over a drafting table, tongue poking out in concentration. Just a little more tired. A little more weathered. So was I. "This is the one," I said. "Isn't it?" He turned, and his whole face lit up. "This is the one." The agent, a young guy named Marcus with an eager smile, clapped his hands together. "You two are the easiest clients I've had all month." The seller's motivated, just dropped the price $15,000. "They're asking $5,000 in earnest money today. We sign the contract, then you wire the rest of the down payment within a week." "No problem." I pulled out my wallet, fingers closing around my backup debit card, the one with a few thousand for day-to-day expenses. "Let's do this." I swiped. The terminal beeped. And then, in cheerful green letters on the screen, * transaction declined. Insufficient funds, *. I blinked. That can't be right. Try again. Same result. The little screen seemed to mock me with its cheerful refusal. Marcus's smile flickered, uncertain. Dan glanced at me, his brow furrowing. Ellie, is everything okay? I can put the earnest money on my card. Just give me a second. I stepped away, pulse hammering in my throat, and opened my banking app with clumsy fingers. The screen loaded. The balance was just over $400. I stared at the number. I'd had nearly $5,000 in that account last month. Where had it? And then memory crashed over me in a sickening wave. Sophie's emergency call 3 weeks ago. Her car had broken down and she needed $2,000 for repairs. Just a loan. She'd pay me back next week. Sophie's texts about the professional certification course that would change her career. Another $1,200. Please, Ellie, I'm desperate. Sophie's birthday request for a designer handbag she'd been eyeing, because Greg's being stingy lately, and she deserved something nice. I transferred the money each time without a second thought. The amounts had seemed small in isolation, easy to justify. She's my sister. She's struggling. I'll get it back. But added together, over months of slow, steady bleeding, they drained the account dry. Cold sweat prickled across my back. My hands had gone numb. Ellie. Dan was beside me now, his voice low with concern. Is there a problem with the account? I can cover the earnest money. I've got some savings set aside for closing costs. We can use that. It's not a big deal. No. The word came out sharper than I meant. I swallowed hard and tried to soften my face into something reassuring. Dan, I need to sort something out. Can we come back tomorrow? He looked at me for a long moment. I could see him running through possibilities in his head, trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But he didn't push. He never pushed. That was the thing about Dan. He trusted me so completely that it never occurred to him I might be hiding a disaster. Okay, he said slowly. Tomorrow. No rush. Marcus, we'll be in touch. I couldn't look at him. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I'd let my sister drain my backup account like a slow leak, and now the main account, the $80,000, was sitting in my mother's apron pocket. The woman who had never, not once in 30 years, chosen me first. I made an excuse about a work emergency and took the bus to my parents' apartment. The whole way there, I rehearsed what I would say. Asterisk mom, give me the card. We're signing the contract. I need it now, asterisk simple. Direct. Impossible to misunderstand. The bus rattled over potholes, and I gripped the seat in front of me until my knuckles whitened. Sophie was on the couch when I arrived, scrolling through her phone, a half-eaten bowl of strawberries on the coffee table. She changed into designer loungewear, soft cashmere, the kind of thing that cost more than my monthly train pass. Martha was watering the plants on the balcony, her back to the room. Henry sat in his usual armchair with the newspaper, reading glasses perched on his nose, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. Mom. Martha turned. Her face did something complicated when she saw me. Surprise, then a quick, practiced smoothing over, like a curtain being drawn across a window. Ellie. Back so soon. How did the house hunting go? Did you find anything worthwhile? Mom, did you touch the card I left with you? The watering can stop mid-tilt. A few drops splashed onto the balcony tiles. What card? Oh, that one. She set the can down carefully, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and walked inside. No, I told you. I'm just holding it. It's perfectly safe. My backup account is almost empty. Sophie's been borrowing from me for months, and I didn't realize how much it added up to. I need the main card now. Dan and I found a place. We're signing a contract. The silence that followed was heavy and strange, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. On the television, a reality show host shrieked with laughter. The sound was obscene, that canned hilarity, while the floor was dropping out from under my life. Martha set the towel down, walked to the coffee table, and stood there with her hands clasped in front of her. She still didn't look at me. I used it. 2 words. Delivered as if she were announcing she'd paid the electric bill. Used it. The words came out strangled. My throat had closed to a pinhole. What does that mean? Used it asterisk. I gave it to your sister. For her down payment. She and Greg found a condo in a wonderful school district, perfect for when they start a family. The down payment was just a little short, and her in-laws were getting impatient. What was I supposed to do? Let her miss out on her future. The room tilted. I gripped the back of a dining chair to steady myself, the wood cold and solid under my sweating palms. Sophie, on the couch, had the grace to lower her phone. Her expression flickered through several stages: surprise, defensiveness, and finally a kind of defiant righteousness, like a child caught stealing who'd already decided the real crime was getting caught. Sophie and Greg are building a life, Martha continued, her voice picking up momentum, layering conviction over the obvious wrongness of what she'd done. Her in-laws have expectations. No property, no wedding. They'd already put down a deposit on the venue. You're the older sister, you're supposed to want the best for her. Besides, you're not even married yet. Your plans with Dan were always uncertain. Uncertain. I repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. 9 years. 9 years we've been together. We have a mortgage pre-approval. We were signing a contract today. Would you have said yes if I'd asked? Martha's voice rose, her eyes growing wet and indignant. You would have said no. You would have put yourself first, the way you've always done. Eleanor, Sophie is your sister. Your only sister. She needed help. What kind of family would we be if we didn't help each other? A family that asks, I said. A family that doesn't steal. The word landed like a grenade. Martha's face went white, then flushed an ugly, blotchy red. How dare you? I am your mother. I brought you into this world. Everything you have, everything you've achieved, is because of me. And you're standing there, screaming at me over money, calling me a thief. Do you have any idea how that feels? I'm not screaming, I said quietly. I wasn't. My voice had gone cold and flat, drained of all its heat. I'm asking. Did you, or did you not, take $80,000 that belonged to me and give it to Sophie without my knowledge or consent? It wasn't stealing. It was helping your sister. It was keeping the money in the family, where it belongs. Martha's voice cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You don't understand what it's like to be a mother. To have to make impossible choices. Sophie needed me. Greg's family was putting pressure on her. The wedding was at risk. Your money was just sitting there. It was sitting there for my wedding, I said. For my home. For my future. Not Sophie's. Your future with that man. Martha spat the words. A junior architect who can't even afford a proper ring. Who's been stringing you along for 9 years without marrying you. You think he's going to stay. You think he won't take half of everything the moment things get hard. She stepped closer, her eyes wild with a desperate, righteous fury. I protected you, Eleanor. At least this way, the money is in Sophie's name. It stays in the family. It's safe. I stared at her. There it was, the real architecture of her logic, laid bare. Dan was an outsider. Sophie was blood. My money was safer with the sister who'd never held a job longer than 18 months than with the man I'd loved for almost a decade. My mother didn't trust me to choose a partner. She didn't trust me to build a life. And she dressed up this profound disrespect as protection. Sophie's condo is in her name, I said slowly. My $80,000. In her name. You keep saying my money like it means something. Sophie finally rose from the couch, smoothing her cashmere top. Her face had settled into a mask of weary patience, as if I were the unreasonable one. Mom gave it to me. It was a gift. If you have a problem with that, take it up with her. Don't make me the villain. I didn't ask her to do it. She offered. Did you say no? I turned to face her fully. When she offered you $80,000 that wasn't hers to give, did you say no? Sophie's mouth opened, then closed. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of awareness, a brief, uncomfortable recognition. Then it vanished, replaced by the practiced indignation that had served her all her life. That's not fair. You can't put this on me. Mom's a grown woman. She makes her own decisions. If you want to be angry at someone, be angry at her. Enough. Henry's voice cut through the chaos, hoarse and unexpected, like a piece of furniture suddenly speaking. He'd risen from his armchair, the newspaper crumpled in his fist, his reading glasses askew. His face was gray, the color of old ash. The money's gone. Fighting won't bring it back. Eleanor. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. You're the older sister. Sometimes you have to sacrifice for family. That's just how it is. Sacrifice. That word. The same word they'd used when I was 8 and had to give Sophie my new winter coat because she'd lost hers on the bus. The same word when I was 17 and had to skip a summer science program I'd earned so Sophie could go to cheerleading camp. The same word my entire life, and I'd accepted it, swallowed it, built my identity around it, because I believed, desperately, pathetically, that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, one day they'd finally look at me and see someone worth keeping. They never would. I looked at my father, this silent, defeated man who'd watched decades of unfairness and never once raised his voice in my defense, and felt something inside me snap clean in half. Not with a crash. Quietly. The way a tree falls in an empty forest. You're right, I said. The money's gone. So am I. I walked out. I didn't go home. I couldn't face Dan, not yet. I needed to fall apart somewhere private, somewhere no one would witness the collapse. I walked for what felt like hours, my feet carrying me through familiar streets that had suddenly turned foreign, until I found myself at the riverfront downtown. The river was gray and churning, swollen with winter runoff. The wind cut through my coat like surgical steel. I stood at the railing, watching the current swallow the last of the daylight, and felt nothing. My emotions had retreated to some deep, unreachable place, leaving only a hollowed-out numbness behind. Zoe found me there around sunset. She'd been calling for an hour. When she pulled up in her battered Honda, she took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. She just got out, handed me a cigarette, and stood next to me at the railing while I smoked it with shaking hands. Zoe Kim and I had been roommates freshman year of college. She was the kind of friend who'd help you bury evidence and never mention it again. She ran a small graphic design studio now, thriving on caffeine and creative spite, and she was the only person in the world who knew exactly how much my family took from me and how little they ever gave back. I told her everything. The empty backup account. The $80,000. Sophie's condo. My mother's speech about protection. When I finished, Zoe was silent for a long moment. Then she exhaled a plume of smoke and said, "Your mother has spent 30 years teaching you that being treated like garbage is normal. That's not parenting. That's conditioning. She's still my mother." No. Zoe's voice was flat and final. She's the person who gave birth to you. That's biology. Motherhood is something else. Motherhood is showing up. Motherhood is choosing your kid. She's never done that, not once. She's been choosing Sophie since the day you were born, and she's trained you to accept the scraps and say thank you. I didn't answer. Because she was right. And because knowing something is true and feeling it in your bones are two different things. My bones still ached for a mother who didn't exist. I went home after midnight. Dan was waiting on the front steps of our apartment building, a thermos of soup in his hands. The soup had gone cold. He stood up when he saw me, and the look on his face, worried, exhausted, hopeful, nearly shattered what was left of my composure. "I called your parents' place," he said. "Your dad answered. He said you'd left hours ago. I didn't know where you were. I've been..." He stopped, swallowed. "I've been sitting here." "How long?" "A while." We went upstairs. I sat on the couch, and I told him. All of it. The backup account. The 80,000. My mother's theft. Sophie's indifference. Henry's silence. Dan listened without interrupting. His face went through stages: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally a cold, still anger I'd never seen in him before. When I finished, he set the thermos down with excessive care, as if he were afraid of what his hands might do if he didn't control them. "Your mother," he said slowly, "stole $80,000 from you. Gave it to Sophie. And your father told you to accept it." "Yes." "And now we can't buy the condo." "Yes." He stood up abruptly and walked to the window. His back was rigid, his shoulders tight. In the reflection, I could see him pressing his knuckles against the glass. "Ellie," he said, his voice strained, "you know this isn't about the money for me. You know that, right? I don't care about the money. We can save again. We can find another place. We can wait another year, 2 years, 5 years. I don't care. Dan. But I care about you." He turned around, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "I care that your family treats you like an ATM. I care that they've been doing this your whole life and you've been carrying it alone. I care that your mother thinks so little of you, and of us, that she didn't even hesitate. She didn't even ask. And I don't know how to protect you from that. I don't know how to fix it. You can't fix it." My voice came out raw. "No one can fix it. That's what I'm trying to tell you. This isn't a one-time thing. This is a system. It's been running since I was 6 years old. My mother will never stop taking from me to give to Sophie. Sophie will never stop accepting. And if I try to set a boundary, I'm the villain. If I say no, I'm selfish. If I walk away, I'm abandoning my family. There's no winning. There's only staying or leaving." Dan crossed the room and knelt in front of me, taking my frozen hands in his. "Then we leave. Together. We move to another city, another state. We start fresh, somewhere they can't reach us. And then what? I pulled my hands away, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to feel the full weight of this decision. Every time the phone rings, you'll wonder if it's them. Every holiday, you'll watch me check my messages and find nothing. You'll watch me grieve a family I still love, even though they've broken me. You'll live with the wreckage. Dan, you deserve someone whole. Someone who doesn't come with a wrecking ball swinging in the background. I don't want someone whole. His voice cracked. I want you. I've wanted you for 9 years. Don't make this decision for me. Don't decide I'm better off without you. That's my choice to make. I looked at him. This kind, stubborn, ordinary, extraordinary man who'd loved me through every version of myself, and I knew, with a clarity that felt like a knife between the ribs, that I was going to lose him. Not because he would leave. Because I would push him away. Because I couldn't bear the thought of him waking up 10 years from now, exhausted by my family's endless demands, resenting me for the life we could have had. Diane, I said, and my voice was steady even as everything inside me shattered, I'm leaving. I know. We'll leave together. No. I'm leaving the country. There's a job in London. Zoe's friend referred me. I interviewed last month. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure. They called this morning. They want me. I swallowed. I'm going to take it. He let go of my hands. Sat back on his heels. The color drained from his face. London. Yes. For how long? I don't know. A while. Maybe a long while. You're running away. It wasn't an accusation. It was a recognition, quiet and devastated. Yes, I said, because it was true. He was silent for a long time. Outside, a car alarm went off and died. Someone's dog barked twice. The refrigerator hummed its ancient, rattling hum. All the ordinary sounds of a life that was ending. Okay, he said finally. His voice was barely a whisper. If that's what you need. Okay. He didn't fight me. That was the worst part. He didn't fight me because he understood, maybe better than I did, that I wasn't just running from my family. I was running from myself. From the version of Eleanor Vance who'd spent 30 years begging for scraps of love from people who'd never, ever give her enough. He left at dawn. I watched from the window as he sat on the curb outside our building, head in his hands, for nearly an hour. When he finally stood up and walked away, he didn't look back. I flew to London a week later. The first year in London was the hardest. I'd rented a tiny studio flat in East London, barely 300 square feet, with a hot plate instead of a proper stove and a shower that alternated between scalding and freezing with no warning. The building was old and drafty, and the upstairs neighbors had enthusiastic arguments at 2 a.m. in a language I didn't recognize. On my first night, I sat on the single bed with its thin, institutional mattress and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, sirens that wailed in a different key, seagulls screaming over the Thames, the rumble of the night bus outside my window, and wondered if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. But I got up the next morning. And the morning after that. And every morning for the next decade. I threw myself into work with a ferocity that surprised even me. The company that hired me, Deep Blue Dynamics, a mid-sized tech firm in Shoreditch, was growing fast, and I grew with it. I coded through weekends. I volunteered for the hardest projects, the ones no one else wanted. I stayed late enough that the night security guard learned my name and started bringing me tea. The work was demanding and precise and completely absorbing, and when I was deep in a debugging session at 3 in the morning, I didn't have to think about my mother or Sophie or the life I'd left behind. 𝐃𝐄 didn't betray you. 𝐃𝐄 didn't steal from you. 𝐃𝐄 did exactly what you told it to do. Within 3 years, I was leading a team of 8 engineers. Within 6, I was promoted to director of engineering, managing 30 people, most of them men, all of them eventually learning that the quiet woman with the unplaceable accent was not to be underestimated. I bought a small flat near Canary Wharf, not because I needed the space, but because it was mine. I painted the walls myself. I hung art I'd chosen. I bought plants and kept them alive, which felt like proof of something. I ran along the Thames on misty mornings. I learned to cook proper risotto and to drink single malt scotch and to say, "I'm fine," in 5 different ways so no one would ask follow-up questions. I became fluent in the particular dialect of British politeness that allows you to deflect intimacy while seeming perfectly friendly. I didn't date. There were opportunities. A colleague from the Berlin office who sent me poetry, a consultant at a conference who bought me a drink and told me I had beautiful hands, a woman I met at a gallery opening who made me laugh for the first time in months. I turned them all down, gently and firmly. Dan's ghost still lived in the space beside me, the shape of him worn into my life like a groove in a wooden floor. I'd check his social media sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, and then hate myself for it. His profile went mostly quiet after the first year. Zoe told me, during one of our marathon video calls, that he'd gotten married to a kindergarten teacher, a soft-spoken woman with a kind smile. He cried at the wedding, Zoe said. Not happy tears. Well, not only happy tears. I'd ended the call and sat in the dark for a long time, feeling something I didn't have a name for. My therapist, a patient Nigerian-British woman named Dr. Okonkwo, told me this was called detached concern. It was the best I could manage. You've built very strong walls, Eleanor, she said once, in her calm, unhurried voice. They've kept you safe. But walls don't just keep pain out. They keep everything out. I knew she was right. I also knew I wasn't ready to tear them down. Zoe kept me updated on the news from home. Sophie's marriage was strained, Greg's business had never quite recovered from an early setback, and the condo my $80,000 had paid for was mortgaged to the hilt. Sophie had a son now, Leo, and posted elaborate family photos on social media that looked like advertisements for a happiness she didn't actually possess. Martha's health deteriorated year by year. Heart problems. Several hospitalizations. Each time, Sophie visited just long enough to be photographed at the bedside, never long enough to help with the actual care. Henry did all of it, the medications, the appointments, the sleepless nights in uncomfortable hospital chairs. He'd retired early to manage the growing burden, shrinking into a life of quiet, exhausted service. I sent money occasionally, not to my mother, but to my father's personal account, for his own needs. I never called to check on him. I couldn't. The sound of his voice would have cracked something open, and I was afraid of what might spill out. So I sent money and kept my distance, and told myself it was enough. And then, 10 years after I left, my phone rang at 3 in the morning. Ellie. My father's voice was a thing I barely recognized, thin, ragged, scraped hollow. Like he'd been screaming into a void and had nothing left. Your mother, she's gone. Heart attack. 3 days ago. It was sudden. She was at home, in her chair. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear. Rain streaked the window. The Thames was a black ribbon in the distance, scattered with the reflected lights of the wharves. My flat was very quiet. She was holding something when she died, Henry said. A photograph. Do you remember that day at the park? You were 6. You and Sophie fell into the pond. She had a picture from that day. You were standing there, soaking wet, trying to smile. She kept it in her nightstand. I didn't even know she had it. But she was holding it when I found her. I closed my eyes. I remembered the shock of the cold water, the mud sucking at my shoes, the way my mother had run to Sophie first, her face twisted with panic, the way I'd stood there, dripping and invisible, shivering so hard my teeth chattered, watching her wrap my screaming sister in a towel and murmur soothing words. I tried to smile for the camera. Someone's father had been taking pictures, because I'd already learned that girls who smiled got more of what they needed than girls who cried. She left you a letter, Henry said. She wrote it years ago. Made me promise I'd give it to you in person. She said it was the only thing she could leave you that Sophie couldn't take. I booked a flight that night. The funeral home smelled of lilies and old carpet and the faint, sweet undertone of decay that no amount of air freshener can mask. Martha Vance's portrait hung on the wall, black and white, a gentle smile, the same photograph I'd taken when I was 22 with my first real camera. Back then, I still believed I could earn her love if I tried hard enough. If I sent enough money. If I came home often enough. If I was good enough, patient enough, forgiving enough. She'd been beautiful, my mother. Even in black and white, you could see it, the high cheekbones, the arch of her brow. Sophie had inherited that beauty. I'd inherited my father's sturdy, unremarkable face, the kind of face people forgot 5 minutes after meeting you. My mother used to look at Sophie and say, "You're going to break hearts someday." She never said anything like that to me. I stood in front of that portrait for a long time, the silence pressing against my ears. Henry hovered behind me, thinner than I remembered, his spine curved like a question mark. His hands trembled slightly, whether from grief or age or both, I couldn't tell. "Here," he said, pressing an envelope into my hands. It was yellowed and soft at the edges, the paper worn thin from years of handling. My name was written on the front in my mother's careful, looping cursive, Eleanor. Not Ellie. Eleanor. My full name, the one she only used when she was being formal. Or, apparently, when she was writing a letter she knew she might never deliver. She wrote it over and over, Henry said quietly. Draft after draft. Threw most of them away. This was the one she kept. She put it under her pillow every night. The last thing she did before she fell asleep that night was read this letter. I opened it carefully, aware that the paper might tear. The handwriting inside was shaky, the ink uneven in places where her hand had trembled or tears had fallen. The letter was dated 7 years ago. Ellie. Asterisk, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I've imagined writing these words so many times, and now that the time has come, I don't know how to begin. Asterisk. Asterisk, I know you hate me. You have every right. I've spent the last 3 years, since you left, understanding that. Asterisk. Asterisk, when you first walked out that door, I told myself you were being dramatic. A daughter abandoning her family over money. It was a convenient story, and I clung to it, because the alternative was too painful. The alternative was admitting that I'd been failing you since the day you were born. Asterisk. Asterisk, it took me years to realize it was never about the money. The money was just the final weight on a scale that had been tipped against you for 30 years. Every time I chose Sophie over you. Every time I told myself you were strong enough to handle it. Every time I saw the hurt in your eyes and looked away because it was easier than changing asterisk. Asterisk I went to Sophie's house, about a year after you left. I begged her to start paying you back. I told her it was wrong, what we did. She screamed at me. She said I was choosing you over her, that I'd always loved you more. Can you imagine? I've given her everything, and she still believes she's the deprived one. She stopped visiting. She stopped calling unless she needed something, money, usually, or free childcare. The daughter I sacrificed everything for barely remembers I exist unless I'm useful to her, asterisk. Asterisk you were the one who stayed. All those years, you were the one who called on my birthday. Who sent money when the roof needed repairs. Who asked if I was taking my medication. You gave and gave, and I took and took, and I never once said thank you. I never once told you I was proud of you, asterisk. Asterisk I'm saying it now, even though it's too late. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. I've always been proud of you. I just didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to love you without the distance I'd created between us, asterisk. Asterisk your father and I have been saving. Every pension check, every dollar we could spare. It's not $80,000. It's a little over 40,000. It's in a savings account with your name on it now. Your father has the details. I know it's not enough. It will never be enough, asterisk. Asterisk, but I needed you to know, before I go, that I know. I know I broke something between us that can't be fixed. I know I gave your sister the love you deserved and gave you the burden she should have carried. I know the word sorry is too small for a wound 30 years deep, asterisk. Asterisk still. I'm sorry, asterisk. Asterisk if there's anything after this life, I'll spend it trying to become the mother you should have had. The one who saw you. The one who chose you. The one who ran to you first, asterisk. Asterisk please don't let what I did make you hard forever. You deserved a soft life. You still do, asterisk. Mom. There was a second sheet, in my father's blocky, ungraceful handwriting. Ellie. Asterisk your mother cried for a long time after writing this. She kept it under her pillow every night. The night she died, she was holding it. She was still holding it when I found her, asterisk. Asterisk I know I failed you too. I was quiet when I should have spoken. I looked away when I should have intervened. I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as protecting my family. It wasn't. It was cowardice, asterisk. Asterisk don't carry this anger any longer than you have to. Not for her sake, she's gone now, and your forgiveness or bitterness won't reach her. But for your own sake. You've been carrying a weight that was never yours to bear. You can set it down now, asterisk. Dad. I stood in that dim room, the letter trembling in my hands, and wept. Not for the $40,000, I didn't need it anymore. Not even for the apology, though it was more than I'd ever expected to receive. I wept for the 6-year-old girl in the wet dress, standing on the muddy edge of a pond, waiting for her mother to turn around. I wept for the 22-year-old who'd taken that photograph, still believing she could earn love through effort and sacrifice. I wept for the 30-year-old who'd fled across an ocean, carrying nothing but a broken heart and a conviction that she was fundamentally unlovable. I wept because the apology had come, finally, but the person who needed to hear it no longer existed. That girl had grown up. She'd built walls. She'd learned to survive without the love she was owed. She'd become someone else entirely, someone who no longer believed in happy endings or maternal redemption. And the woman who'd withheld that love was gone before she could give it. The front door banged open. I wiped my face quickly, folded the letter, and slipped it into my coat pocket. Sophie strode into the living room like she was walking onto a stage she performed on 100 times, because, in a sense, she was. Her husband Greg trailed behind her with the defeated shuffle of a man who'd stopped expecting dignity years ago. Their son Leo, now 10 years old, slouched near the door with his face buried in a smartphone. Sophie saw me and stopped. Her eyes swept over my coat, my shoes, my posture, still cataloging, still comparing, still finding me wanting in ways I no longer cared about. Ellie, you actually came. Her voice was carefully neutral, but there was a tremor beneath it. Uncertainty, maybe. Or guilt, dressed up as hostility. I wasn't sure you'd bother. 10 years is a long time. Sophie, I hope you're not here to make trouble. She crossed her arms. Mom's apartment, we should discuss it like adults. I've been the one handling everything while you've been off living your glamorous London life. The hospital bills. The funeral arrangements. The paperwork. Do you have any idea how much paperwork is involved when someone dies? And where were you? Sipping lattes in some cafe in Soho. Henry's face darkened. Your mother's body is barely cold, Sophie. The memorial service hasn't even happened yet. Show some respect. Dad, someone has to be practical. Sophie's voice pitched upward, taking on the quality of a woman who'd been rehearsing this conversation for days. Ellie's not going to live here. She's got her fancy job and her fancy flat in London. What does she need a rundown apartment in this neighborhood for? I, on the other hand, have a family. Greg's business still hasn't recovered from the pandemic. Leo's school is expensive. You know private education isn't cheap. And our mortgage. She trailed off, her composure cracking slightly. Mom would have wanted to help. She always helped. Mom would have wanted you to visit her in the hospital, I said quietly. She would have wanted you to answer her calls. She would have wanted you to be there when she was dying instead of at another business dinner. Sophie's face went white, then flushed an ugly, mottled red. How dare you? You disappeared for 10 years. 10 years. You didn't call. You didn't visit. You didn't come home for a single holiday. You have no right, no right, to come back now and play the devoted daughter. You abandoned her. You abandoned all of us. I left, I said evenly. There's a difference between leaving and abandoning. I still sent money for Dad. I still called. I just stopped letting her use me. That's not fair. Fair. The word came out sharper than I intended. You want to talk about fair, Sophie? You took $80,000 from me. You took Mom's retirement savings. You took every ounce of her energy and attention for 30 years. And when she got sick, when she needed you to show up, you were too busy. Too busy to sit with her. Too busy to hold her hand. Too busy to be there when she died. I took a step closer, and Sophie actually flinched. You want to talk about fair? I'll tell you what's fair. I'm done fighting you for scraps. Take the apartment. I don't want it. I've never wanted anything from this family except basic decency, and I learned a long time ago I wasn't going to get it. Sophie blinked, her righteous anger derailed by the sudden, unexpected victory. You mean that? You're not going to contest the will. There's no will to contest. I'm not interested in the apartment. But, she stopped, clearly recalibrating. The apartment was hers. She'd won. But winning didn't seem to feel the way she'd expected. Okay. Good. That's sensible of you. Sophie. I looked at my sister, this woman who'd been given every advantage, every scrap of our mother's devotion, and had repaid it with negligence and entitlement. Up close, she looked older than her years. The lines around her mouth were deeper than they should have been. Her expensive clothes hung a little too loosely, as if she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her eyes had the haunted, slightly feral quality of someone who'd been treading water for years and was beginning to realize the shore wasn't getting any closer. "This is the last thing you get from me," I said. "The apartment. Whatever else Mom left behind. Take it. But here's what comes with it. When Dad needs help, and he will, you'll be the one to provide it. When the roof leaks and the bills pile up and the loneliness sets in, you'll be the one who shows up. And when you're lying awake at night, wondering why your life feels so empty despite everything you've taken." I paused. "Don't call me for the answer. You already know what it is." Sophie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind her, Greg shifted uncomfortably. Leo didn't look up from his phone. He'd learned, the way children in unhappy homes often do, to disappear into screens when the adults started fighting. I turned to Henry and hugged him. He felt fragile in my arms, bird-boned and trembling, his spine a delicate ridge beneath his thin sweater. "I have to go," I said. "My flight's tonight." "So soon." His voice cracked. "Your mother's memorial is in 2 days. You could stay. You could say something. You could." "I can't." I pulled back and looked at his face, the deep, weathered grooves, the watery eyes, the decades of defeat written into every line. "But I'll call. I promise. And if you need anything, anything, you tell me." "I mean it, Dad." He nodded, not trusting his voice. I walked out of the apartment, past Sophie's stunned, complicated silence, past the black and white portrait on the wall, past the kitchen where, 10 years ago, my mother had slipped my future into her apron pocket and smiled as if she were doing nothing wrong. The hallway was brighter than I remembered. Someone had finally replaced the burned-out light. Zoe was waiting in the car. She took one look at me and handed me a coffee without a word. She pulled away from the curb and headed toward the airport, the city rolling past in a blur of gray concrete and winter-bare trees and the kind of familiar, faded billboards that only exist in neighborhoods too unfashionable to gentrify. Halfway there, I pulled out my phone and stared at a contact I hadn't opened in years. Dan Callahan. The number might not even be his anymore. People changed numbers. People moved. People moved on. Zoe glanced over. "You should call him. He's probably remarried by now." "He's not." She signaled, changed lanes with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd been driving in this city her whole life. "He got married about 7 years ago. It didn't last. They divorced 3 years in, no kids. He asked about you at a party last year. Pretended it was casual. Oh, by the way, have you heard from Ellie?" But he couldn't look me in the eye when he said it. My heart did something complicated, a squeeze, a stumble, a sudden and inconvenient flare of hope. "It's been 10 years. So what?" Zoe's voice was sharp with affectionate exasperation. "You've been miserable for 10 years. He's been miserable for 10 years. At a certain point, it's been too long, stops being a reason and starts being an excuse. Call him. Or don't. But stop pretending you're over it." I didn't call. Not yet. Some things can't be repaired with a phone call from a moving car. But I didn't delete the number either. I just sat with it, the possibility of it, like a small flame cupped in my hands, something I hadn't allowed myself to hold in a very long time. At the terminal, Zoe hugged me hard enough to crack a rib. Don't wait another 10 years to come back, okay? I mean it. I'm not getting any younger. I won't. And Ellie? She pulled back, her eyes bright with the particular ferocity of someone who'd loved me through my worst years. You deserved better. You always did. From your mother. From Sophie. From everyone who took and never gave back. Don't let their failures convince you you're not worth showing up for. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Then I walked through security, found my gate, and sat by the window, watching planes rise and fall against the gray winter sky. The letter was still in my coat pocket, folded small. I took it out and read the last lines again, my mother's shaky handwriting blurring slightly through the glass of my tears. Asterisk, you deserved a soft life. You still do, asterisk. Maybe I did. Maybe it wasn't too late to learn how to let the walls down, slowly, carefully, one brick at a time. Maybe the 6-year-old girl in the white dress didn't have to spend the rest of her life standing on the edge of a pond, waiting for someone to notice she was cold. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers. I stood up, tucked the letter back into my pocket, next to my passport, and walked toward the gate. Behind me, the winter sun broke briefly through the clouds, flooding the terminal with pale gold light. I didn't turn around to look. I was too busy watching the path ahead. This time, I was walking towards something. Not away. And somewhere in my phone, a contact name glowed quietly in the dark. Dan Callahan, uncalled. Unresolved. But still there. Still waiting. Maybe that was enough, for now. The knowledge that some doors could still be opened. That some stories didn't have to end where you left them. I boarded the plane, took my seat by the window, and watched the coastline recede beneath the clouds. And I made a decision, when I landed, I'd call him. Not to demand anything. Not to resurrect the past. Just to say hello. To see if his voice still sounded the same. To find out if 10 years was too long or not long enough. Because I'd spent my whole life waiting for my mother to choose me, waiting for apologies that never came, waiting for a fairness that wasn't coming. And I was done waiting. I was done letting the wounds of the past decide the shape of my future. If there was a second chance waiting on the other end of that phone line, I was going to reach for it. With both hands. Without apology. The plane banked over the Atlantic, heading east, and I closed my eyes. The letter rested against my heart, my mother's final words pressed against the steady rhythm of my pulse. I hadn't forgiven her, not fully, not yet. Maybe I never would. But I understood her now, in a way I hadn't before. She'd spent her whole life giving everything to the wrong daughter, and by the time she realized her mistake, it was too late to fix it. I wouldn't make the same mistake. I wouldn't spend the rest of my life giving my future to the ghosts of my past. Somewhere below, the ocean stretched endlessly, dark and glittering. Ahead, London waited. And beyond that, who knew? Maybe a second chance. Maybe a different kind of ending. Maybe, finally, a life that felt like my own.